Greetings! This month, we have curated a series focusing on the results of the United States presidential election, the new Trump administration's expected approach to North Korea first, and then we move on to the emerging trends in international North Korea studies. In November 2024, the world closely watched who became the next president of the United States. The candidates were Kamala Harris, the vice president under the Biden administration, and Donald Trump, who had met with the Kim 정은을 during the North Korea-US-North Korea summit. The American public gave President Trump another opportunity, say the Trump administration 2.0. It remains to be seen whether a second Trump administration will strive to resume the discussions previously held with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Singapore, and Hanoi. Do you remember? Director of Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy, Troy Stangaron of 윌슨센터, a leading U.S. think tank, offers valuable insights on this topic. Then we explore international perceptions of North Korea, featuring experts from Taiwan, Poland, and then Italy, who provide perspectives that might differ from U.S. perspectives. Professor Chai Chung-min from National Zhengzi University in Taiwan, Professor Antonio Fiori from the University of Bologna, and Dr. Oskar Piastritz of the Polish Institute of International Affairs are contributing to the discussion. Today, we invited a very distinguished, policy analyst and scholar, Troy Stangaron, and then he is the director of Hyundai Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy, and also deputy director of the Indo-Pacific program at the 윌슨센터. Right, he is going to give us a lecture on Donald Trump administrations in North Korea policy, and then his take on this, the expectation of the Donald Trump administration and the North Korea's negotiation, and on and on and on. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to do this. And having just had an election in the United States, we are in this process of going through a presidential transition. And as I'm sure your audience knows, former President Donald Trump has won the election and will become the United States president on January 20th. During this past election, former President Trump campaigned on the idea of peace through strength. This was a reaction, in essence, to his and other Republican views that former President Biden had shown weakness in foreign policy. So if we look back, for example, at the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the challenges the United States faced there, the outbreak of war in Ukraine, something President Trump has insisted would not have happened if he were still in office, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, there was this sense, at least by the former president's side, that the United States needed to take and show more strength in international affairs. And so when we look at U.S. policy and what we might expect in the Indo-Pacific region or East Asia, and then more specifically in North Korea, the main focus of the Trump presidency's policy will be China. This is an area to where there is overarching political agreement within the United States. We saw last year there, for example, was a bipartisan House Commission on China. It put out a series of recommendations, many of those to deal with China's economic challenges to the United States. But while there's great political polarization in the United States, the one area where you do see a lot of political agreement is on China. And so when we think about the idea of peace through strength, if you look at who former President Trump has taken and so far selected for his cabinet, we have Senator Marco Rubio has the Secretary of State, Congressman Mike Waltz has National Security Advisor. And if you look at other appointees on the security side, including at DOD, what you see is essentially a series of China hawks. And this would seem to align with the policy of a strong policy towards China. But as with President Trump, we know that economic issues matter. And so Howard Lutnick, who he's nominated as Secretary of Commerce, one of the things that President Trump has said is that Howard Lutnick would be responsible for U.S. trade and tariff policy. And we know that tariffs are going to be a key point of the Trump administration's policy, both towards China and towards other parts of the world, with the idea of the universal tariff and tariff increases on China and also potentially Mexico and other actors. But one of the things that is sort of interesting about this is that while Senator Rubio, Congressman Waltz, they insist on sort of confronting China, both in the security realm, being strong on on Taiwan, and really taking in, basically pushing China to take and confront it, as opposed to the Biden administration's approach of trying to take and cooperate with China on some issues while also challenging them on others. This could also be what we see ultimately as policy within the Trump administration, because Lutnick takes a much more nuanced view of the use of tariffs. He views them as negotiating leverage. And we know that what ultimately matters really for President Trump is economic issues. So this could suggest that the overall policy towards China and ultimately towards North Korea, which I'll get to in a moment, could be slightly more nuanced. You could see some contradictions, but also that it might not be as hard of a line as some people think so far. Now, when we think about North Korea policy, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that former President Trump will face a different situation than when he came to office in 2017. When he originally came to office the first time, Russia and China, in essence, worked with both the Obama administration before him and the Trump administration to address the growing missile tests and nuclear tests by North Korea. We saw a series of UN sanctions put in place that China and Russia both supported. And at the same time, they encouraged the negotiations between the United States and North Korea. Now, if we look at the current situation, many of the pieces of leverage, what former President Trump called maximum pressure, are gone. Sanctions have been a tool of pressure have dissipated. Right now, starting probably about the time the Hanoi summit failed, we saw that basically Russia and China began to take and start to look at sanctions as something that perhaps aren't helpful anymore. And if we look at what former panel of expert members have said, the Russian and Chinese governments both started to back away from sanctions around that time period. So now, given the outbreak of war in Ukraine, we know that explicitly Russia is no longer enforcing sanctions. It's unlikely that China is putting much pressure in terms of sanctions on North Korea either. So much of the pressure tool that we have in terms of economic pressure has been taken away. At the same time, it seems as though Pyongyang has determined that talks with the United States are not beneficial. We've seen this through some of the comments in the US presidential election, to where while it's good that President Trump and Kim Jong-un have good relations, that ultimately relations are going to be state to state and that personalities don't matter. We've also seen other comments suggesting that North Korea may not be too interested in having talks with the United States. But ultimately, the real factor here, I think, is North Korea's relationship with Russia. This has provided Pyongyang with options in terms of what it may do in terms of foreign policy, and given it a way to not necessarily have to engage with the United States in the way it did prior to the pandemic. And so why is the case? When we look at the relationship, we've seen Russia and North Korea not only engage in arms trade and potential sanctions violations in terms of financial sanctions, which have been reported by the New York Times, and in other measures, but really you've seen this relationship grow to become more faceted through the summit meeting this past year with Chairman Kim and President Putin, where they took and they increased their defense relationship by signing a new defense treaty. They took and put in place more means to take and cooperate economically. And you really see this as a growing relationship, one to which Russia has taken and provided political support to North Korea and the UN by taking and vetoing the expansion of the panel of experts mandate. Now, at the same time, US-China competition complicates any leverage that a Trump administration might try to take and gain on North Korea, while China remains the largest licit trading partner for North Korea, though I think there's good reason to believe that overall Russia is now the largest trading partner for North Korea. Because of that competition, there's less incentive for China to take and work cooperatively with the United States on North Korea. And if the Trump administration pursues a policy that is much more aggressive than the Biden administration, I would expect that incentive structure to further decrease for Beijing to cooperate with the United States on North Korea. But ultimately, any real North Korea policy may be tied to the outcome of the war in Ukraine. We've seen some discuss this idea that Russia would end its relationship with with North Korea at the end of the war. I think there's good reasons to believe that might not be the case, but there are indications that the Trump team may be looking to try and any package deal with Russia have them take and eliminate this relationship they've been developing with Pyongyang. But there are good reasons to think that Russia may be reluctant to do this and that the Trump administration may not have the types of incentive structures it needs to get that in place. So one, both Russia and North Korea share a revisionist view of the world. We clearly see this in Russian aggression in Ukraine, but clearly as North Korea moves more towards this idea of two states on the Korean Peninsula, perhaps looking to take and put in claims towards the islands of the West Sea, we see a revisionist nature taking place. At the same time, both North Korea and Russia want a multipolar world where there's less U.S. influence. The U.S. has been a power that has essentially taken and boxed them in politically and taken and lessened their scope for maneuver internationally, and they would like to see that change and for the U.S. to have less influence over their and other countries' actions. And at the same time, one of the United States' strengths in terms of both sanctions and dealing with problematic behavior, be it North Korean nuclear tests or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has been the strength of the U.S. financial system and the financial sanctions you put in place. Because of the dominant role of the U.S. dollar, all transactions have to go through the United States, specifically the New York Fed, and that gives the United States the ability to take and track transactions and see what's going on and to enforce financial sanctions on Russia, North Korea, and others. And so this isn't an interest that is shared just between Russia and Moscow. It's one we saw at the recent BRICS summit that China and even Brazil and other countries are behind. But I think all of these interests take and suggest that in a post-Ukraine period, there is significant likelihood that the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang will remain. It will be a different relationship than it is now, but you'll see that continued relationship. And so this is why it's key for the Trump administration to include that as part of any talks with Russia over over Ukraine. So when we think about how President Trump might approach this issue, I think it's interesting that in a pre-election article, former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien noted that there's a development of a new Beijing-Moscow Tehran axis. What's interesting about this is that it left North Korea out. And instead, what former NSA O'Brien actually says is that North Korea was a country that former President Trump tried to bring in from the cold. And this suggests that both O'Brien and potentially a Trump administration are keeping space available for potential talks with North Korea and to try and have a different type of relationship. One of the key outcomes of the Singapore summit was to build a new U.S.-North Korea relationship. What that would be was never defined, and I think figuring out from a Trump administration perspective what they would like that relationship to be would be a key point in any talks going forward. But I think we can't rule out the possibility of talks. That being said, there are, as I've mentioned, clear constraints in terms of this relationship with Russia. I think there are questions about whether Kim Jong-un, given what happened in Hanoi, would be interested in taking a meeting with President Trump again without specific assurances to avoid a potential walkout again. But this is something that we can't rule out. So if the Trump administration is going to approach North Korea, what is likely to be on the table? What might not be on the table? If President Trump is able to take and separate North Korea from Russia, I think that there are specific flexibilities that could be in play. Without Russian support, really Pyongyang would have to take and focus on its relationship with Beijing. There might be questions about whether it's time now to take and maybe move back into talks, especially if President Trump is looking to make a broader deal, maybe something with China at the same time. So all of these factors could be in play working together. Now, if that's the case, we could see some broader type of relationship. Denuclearization, though, may not be on the table, and I think we need to understand that. But it's more likely to be on the table if you have a situation to where the ties with Russia have been severed between it and North Korea, and perhaps Beijing is coming back into the discussions. If, on the other hand, we see a relationship between Russia and North Korea that remains stable, I think there are going to be real challenges in taking and having a robust deal, specifically one that would address denuclearization. And the reason for this, and I just want to kind of walk through briefly, is if we look at the relationship that's been developing, right now, we can sort of see some outlines of what North Korea has already gained from this relationship. In addition to the end of the UN panel of experts and Russian invitations to at least some of the smaller BRIC meetings that we saw earlier this year, which is providing it some additional diplomatic coverage, there are likely real financial benefits that are going to North Korea from this relationship. South Korean estimates suggest that 9 million artillery shells have been shipped from North Korea to Russia. Those artillery shells, depending on the estimates that have been put out, one of which I have worked on, suggests that North Korea is likely receiving compensation of between $477 per round to $500 per round. That means that just on the artillery shells alone, you're likely seeing North Korea receiving benefits of upwards of $4.3 billion. And that doesn't take into account the KN-23 ballistic missiles that we've seen used by Russia in the Ukraine war, or the recent deployment of over 10,000 North Korean troops. And if we just look at the numbers in terms of troops, Russian press sources suggest that the average Russian recruit earns $2,166 a month. At over 10,000 troops, that suggests there's potential significant revenue just in the troop deployment for North Korea beyond the $4.3 billion I suggested. And if we look at what's coming back, there's been a lot of discussion that Russia is providing North Korea, for example, with fuel, with food, perhaps medicine, and some other consumer items. But if we look at the patterns of imports over Kim Jong-un's period in power, take and use sort of the highest levels that we've seen during that period, use those as sort of proxies for what might be being imported. And I think this is a fair estimate because if we look at market prices in North Korea, you're not, for example, seeing prices of rice and other commodities decline significantly, which suggests that Russia isn't flooding North Korea with a large amount of food or fuel. That you could probably get upward towards $1 billion. That suggests that there is likely upwards of 3.2 or more billion dollars worth of compensation that Russia owes North Korea. This is likely going to be on the military side. Ukrainian intelligence has suggested that there is cooperation on ballistic missiles. The KN-23 that I mentioned, we've seen upwards of 50% failure rates on the battlefield. This would seem to be a logical place for Russia to be taking and helping North Korea, because Russia has its own interest in seeing the failure rate of the KN-23 decline. And so if we take and put all this in context, that gives us both sort of a bounds in terms of what Russia might be able to and willing to provide North Korea, but also suggests that North Korea is benefiting both militarily, economically, diplomatically from this relationship with Russia. And any type of new engagement with the United States would need to take and put something on the table that's robust enough to take and pull North Korea away if the Trump administration hasn't been able to do that by ending the Ukraine war. And so in that context where there is less flexibility, we might be seeing something that is more really about taking and focusing on arms control, limiting the growth of North Korea's programs, both ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, but also non-proliferation. One of the other advantages that North Korea is gaining from the war in Ukraine is that it's an opportunity to demonstrate its weapons to other potential buyers around the world. And so having an agreement with North Korea where they do not proliferate, their programs are capped, might be an area to where former President Trump would focus. And part of this would be is that, the challenge that I think the Trump administration faces is that having gone down the denuclearization road in the first term, there have been suggestions that President Trump realizes this may not be something that is feasible. And so if that is the case, then the question is, how do you tamp down the potential challenges you face from North Korea, minimize the chance for conflict, and try to turn the page on the relationship into something that is more productive, so that way perhaps in the future you can make additional progress. And so I think these are the two scenarios we need to consider in terms of President Trump's policy towards North Korea. One, whether he is successful in taking and ending the Ukraine war and doing so in a way to where Russia takes and ends its relationship with North Korea, or if he is not, what the circumstances look like in terms of trying to engage North Korea in a period to where it would have potential support from Russia that would make negotiations with the United States less appealing to North Korea. Thank you, and I look forward to having a discussion.
So Donald Trump administration must, deal with North Korea and then China at the same time, and plus, Russia. So it's all intertwined with each other. You mentioned, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and I think it's Pyongyang, and then some couple more, cities will be included in that. That axis thing, it was a nightmare, to be honest with you. But I think that's coming back, and that's how I see. So, what's your policy recommendation, for the Donald Trump administration to approach, the China in terms of dealing with the North Korea and Russia at the same time? Because China has been very uncomfortable with this, Russo-North Korea rapprochement last, year or so. They didn't say that, but Xi Jinping actually briefly mentioned about he's not very comfortable with this destabilization in the Korean Peninsula as well as, Ukraine, and because of North Korea and Russia. So Donald Trump administration, Donald Trump might be willing to take advantage of this uncomfortable, side of, China over, North Korea and then, Russia for the dealing with the United States. What do you think?
So I think first I want to kind of put the Trump foreign policy in like a broader context. We've talked about China, but if you think about this in terms of priorities, priority number one, ending the Ukraine war, and that obviously has this North Korea link. Priority number two is going to be, basically the Middle East, ending this war. So it's, let's end the wars first, basically. Then once that's done, and depending on how that shapes out, then I think the Trump administration will start moving to really focus on China, and then you get this different North Korea context that you're talking about. Now, how do you take advantage of Chinese unease with the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang? I think this is challenging for a couple reasons. One, even if Beijing is uncomfortable with this relationship, they're clearly not so uncomfortable as to take and really try to step in to stop it. And I think part of this is because if we look at this from China's perspective, I think China views a Russian success in Ukraine as, beneficial to it. And if North Korea is able to take and help enable that to happen, then that benefits China. And so there might be some hurt feelings. I've talked to some colleagues who suggest that perhaps there were some private assurances that were violated between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. But whatever it is, this is like a situation to where if Beijing is unhappy, they're not so unhappy as to want to necessarily intervene. And so that then creates a question of like, how much leverage is there for a Trump administration? Now, if you can end the war in Ukraine, once again, not only does that start changing the dynamics between Russia and North Korea, potentially, but that might start changing some of the Chinese thinking. And so the question then is, how do you take and go about bringing China into this? I think this is where, if you look at the team that he put in place, they would take the approach of we're going to put pressure on China on this issue, whether that would be, secondary sanctions or telling China that part of any deal with the United States means taking and resolving the North Korea issue. I mean, that would be what a real, like, if you want to talk about peace through strength approach would be, is that you would tie these together. You wouldn't take and do China only, you would do China and the parts together. As I mentioned previously, the harder you go towards Beijing, the more it incentivizes Beijing to pull close to Pyongyang.
All right. Okay, thank you so much. And then I think it's a great, lecture at the same time Q&A session. And then, Troy actually showed his prowess, to cover global as well as regional, and then, Korean, peninsula issues, all the, that was great. Thank you so much.
No, thank you again. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.
All right. Thank you so much. Great pleasure, to have you in this, program. And as I told you before, and then this is an interesting, project for the, expanding this, overseas network on North Korea and then Korea unification, studies. So you have, 15 minutes, for your, small lecture. And then we will have a Q&A and a discussion session afterwards. Thank you. It's all yours.
Interestingly, there was also a course offered in Taiwan at NCCU, National Chengchi University, by a professor, Julie Shi. Starting from 2008, he offered this course entitled North Korea Studies for more than 15 years. And he showed the students the materials and also the video clips. And he was also inviting a Japanese journalist, Mr. Fukuda Keisuke of Toyo Keizai, to give a lecture in class. And Mr. Fukuda, he has been a long-term North Korean observer and been to North Korea physically several times. And so he shared his own personal experiences in the class with the students. And that course, every year, the enrollment of the course was over 100, sometimes even 150 students. So clearly you can tell on campus, students feel very curious and they really want to know these countries. And so this class provides a very good venue to let the student get more understanding of the area. And in addition to that, at the University of North Korean Studies in Seoul, they organized a joint conference with National Yangming Jiaodong University in Taiwan in 2018. And that symposium was on the topic of cultural studies and also this diaspora of this North Korean people moving to South Korea. But unfortunately, there is not much study done by Taiwan on North Korea. So actually, this topic encompasses academic and policy-oriented importance for Taiwan, including politics, economics, economy, society, culture, international relations, especially South Korea and Taiwan, or we say South Korea, North Korea relationship and China-Taiwan relationship are the two, after World War II. So we are the only two left, as so-called divided nations. So Taiwan, we actually have a very strong interest in studying North Korea, South Korea relationship more than the domestic politics and economic situations in North Korea. But based on that, there are 5 dimensions that we can still work on. The first is geopolitical importance. Of course, North Korea's actions and policies have considerable implications for regional security in East Asia. Although nowadays people pay more attention to cross-strait relations between Taiwan and China, and also, although China has been sending a lot of PLA Air Force patrolling Taiwan day by day, but North Korea's missile tests are more threatening to the area, not only to South Korea, but even to Japan or to the United States. So the geopolitical importance on North Korea issues are something Taiwan we really would like to know more. Taiwan is close to Korean Peninsula, so which means anything wrong happens on the Korean Peninsula will influence Taiwan. Of course, vice versa. Anything happen across the strait will influence Korean Peninsula as well. So we both of us have the vested interest in understanding North Korean dynamics, especially South Korea is the #1 place because we cannot go to North Korea. So South Korea will be the #1 place to get to know North Korea better. And the second is a diplomatic relationship. Taiwan, we don't have formal diplomatic relationship with North Korea. But interestingly, Taiwanese people could enter North Korea. Although we don't have the non-stop direct flight from Taipei to Pyongyang, but Taiwanese people, citizens, we can go to China, the Northeast China, the borderline city to get a visa and take the train or airplane flight from there to Pyongyang. In Taiwan, we also have the travel agent. They organize regularly the tour to North Korea. So one of my students, he even went to the Pyongyang for marathon many years ago. So that means at least North Korean government is friendly toward Taiwan. So although North Korea recognize the People's Republic of China, PRC, as the sole legitimate government of China, but that does not mean we have bad relationship. So understand North Korea is essential for Taiwan's foreign policy, especially China's attitude toward North Korea is something we should be very careful with. And that relates to our foreign policies, international strategies, and how to position ourselves in East Asia. And third, academic interest. Taiwanese universities and research institutions, we have scholars, they're interested in North Korean studies, but because of very limited information, so we don't really have quite a few research products like journal articles or books, but we do have some translated books from German scholars and Korean scholars on North Korea. So the Taiwanese scholars, their studies cover a range of disciplines, including political science, international relations, sociology, and so on. We often collaborate with international experts and participate the forums on Korean Peninsula issues, but most of that still focusing on the topic of unification instead of the domestic issues in North Korea. And our think tanks and research institutions, they visited South Korea very much to discuss the East Asian security and North Korean affairs, especially the Institute of Reunification in South Korea. That is place providing a lot of information for Taiwanese scholars reference to know more about North Korea and also the North-South relationship. And these places provides analysis and policy recommendations for Taiwanese government, because we also have a government entity on the cross-strait relations, which is a Mainland Affairs Council. But interestingly, the attitude for Taiwanese government toward Chinese government is quite different from South Korean government toward North Korea, or we can say the North-South Korean relationship is very different from cross-strait relations. But there is definitely something to compare and to analyze. So the fifth one is a cultural and historical context. Taiwan's interest in North Korea also include cultural and historical aspects, such as the Korean War's impact on the region and North Korean de facto narratives and comparative studies of certain regions. And these are all the things in which Taiwanese scholars on cultural studies, they are very interested in. And they invite the scholars from South Korea to share their views and ideas about the culture and historic context. And Taiwan has been involving this cross-strait relations since 1949, earlier than North-South Korean relationship. But we have more frequent interaction with Chinese government, and also Taiwanese people we could freely travel to China. So these are very different from what exists between South Korea and North Korea. But I think the nature and the essence of the issue is quite similar. So overall, North Korean studies in Taiwan, although it's quite limited, but I would say we still have quite a few issues that we should work on. And not only the unification, but also go a step further to explore more about the domestic issues, the politics and economics situations and everything cultural. So sometimes I know some Taiwanese scholars, they will invite the foreign scholars teaching in North Korea to give a lecture. I remember there was a few years ago, there was a French scholar teaching in North Korea. He was giving a talk online. That means we still have some interest, quite strong interest, but due to the very limited channel information, but that is not something will prevent us from study more about North Korea. So I would say this issue is under studied. We should do more to promote North Korean studies in Taiwan, and not only just for comparison with cross-strait relations, but also geopolitical landscape and the international security, and then etc. So the overall, I would say the complex dynamics on the Korean Peninsula is not just the issue for North Korea, South Korea, but also for the region in general, and their broader implication for regional and global security is very important for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I think it's interesting, for Taiwanese, scholar, and then academic and policy community to have more interest in the North Korea. I think it's a diplomatic, normalization between, People's Republic of China and then South Korea, Republic of Korea actually, shocked, Taiwan and Korea at the same time, 1992. And then it's interesting, Taiwan and the North Korea try to do something together, to do some damage control, from this, interesting, diplomatic, change landscape, change of landscape in a diplomatic relation in East Asia. But afterwards, you say, there were not much, interaction between Taiwan and North Korea. And probably, Taiwanese people have some different or similar perspective on North Korea. How do they think of North Korea?
In general, we don't really see Taiwanese people pay much attention to North Korea, only if there were some missile tests or military drills.
Okay.
And I think that will make Taiwanese people feel relatively safer because there is a place more dangerous than Taiwan in East Asia. But in general,
then, Korean Peninsula, you're saying.
Yeah. So I would say in general, even the media, we didn't see a lot of news or reports on North Korea. But we do have a TV station. They made a special video for North Korean situation. They went there for a week. They reported and they show a lot of video images, and that really make Taiwanese society feel interesting. So I would say most of time Taiwanese people pay attention to North Korea just because of curiosity, but not really about the close connection or because we don't really see North Korean people in our daily life.
In that sense, I think this is pretty wild scenario, but it's entirely possible, for experts. And then how, Taiwanese experts or, informed, the public, to see the possibility that China, People's Republic of China, take advantage of North Korea for, this China's ambition, to say, to invade and then conquer and occupy, Taiwan for its own, national unification ambition.
For Taiwanese society or even the government, most of time whenever they reported about the North Korean issue or North Korea-China relationship, that's more the information for international politics. For example, if there were something wrong going between North Korea and the US, and we will get to know that China will get involved, like six-party talks, or North Korea's leaders, Kim Jong-un, visited China asking for help, all these things. So we don't really directly link the China-North Korean relationship to cross-strait relationship. We thought that's an independent, separate issues, which means, and China make that, actually the Chinese scholar, they make that quite clearly toward Taiwanese scholar when we have the track 2 meetings. So North Korean issue is only between China and Taiwan, or China and North Korea, or even China, North Korea, and the US. It's nothing to do with Taiwan, because think of this, China take the cross-strait relations and take Taiwan like a family member, but North Korea and North Korean society is still the outsider. So these two issues, one is within the family and one is outside of the family. So at least from China side or from Taiwan side, we don't really see either side get involved these issues with cross-strait relations.
You see, very interesting. I think it's from the United States and Japan and South Korea, and the community of strategic community, that see this Taiwan Strait conflict, military conflict, or the other side, Korean Peninsula, conflict. Actually, if one is happening, then the other probably is, the more like automatically happening.
Yes.
This is a pretty nightmare scenario, for either side. So I think it's interesting that China, your colleagues in China, we try to separate this Taiwan Strait and North Korea and the Korean Peninsula and nuclear issue too. Okay.
And this is actually this is what Chinese strategy, because they localize these issues not only about Taiwan but also South China Sea issue as domestic issues. So by doing this to the larger extent, they could prevent this international involvement from outside. Like whenever the US or the Vietnam, Philippines say anything to South China Sea or on Taiwan, they will claim this is a domestic issue. So cross-strait relations for China is something happening in the family, which cannot be discussed or get involved by outsiders.
So then, from the opposite side, from point of view, what about the United States and Japan? And the United States and Japan actually try to collaborate and with South Korea, Republic of Korea, to actually defend, Taiwan against, China, people's mainland China. And then in that sense, South Korean strategic community, military community have a concerning about entrapment into Taiwan Strait, and then do you see, or you are, an expert friends in the Taiwan strategic community, see this type of, scenario also?
Of course, yeah. For Taiwanese government, we are happy to see if Japan can join the US to help Taiwan. But if we look from the China side, for them, they make that very clearly, okay, Taiwan is the family issue. In East Asia or North Korea, South Korea, Korean Peninsula, even Japan, that's a regional issue. So for China side, they won't talk to the Japan or the US over cross-strait relations that much. Clearly, you can see that. Like Wang Yi just met Blinken. He kept mentioning that this is our family issue. This is something at home. So you cannot touch upon this issue. But for the North Korean issue in China, they take that very serious as regional issue, because sometimes we found North Korea and China, they didn't really get along that well as we expect.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well,
so I think So I think that's quite clear for China. North Korea or Korean Peninsula is a regional issue, but Taiwan is never regional. It's something happening at home.
Well, and then one last question on the Taiwan's take on possible potential Trump, second Trump, presidency.
Yes.
Donald Trump has been making splashes here and there, and then that actually touched upon Taiwan security.
Yes.
And then he discussed about putting more pressure on the paying more money.
Yes.
At the same time,
we took their jobs, so
stealing semiconductor industry from the United States.
Yes.
Okay. And then I think it's a Donald Trump presidency is possible. Of course, it's a Kamala Harris and then other and then many situations is going on. But what do you say, wild prediction for the Donald Trump, to make up on, to influence on the Taiwan Strait situation, and then that actually related to, Korean Peninsula situation in Japan too?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And I would say, actually, we had Donald Trump for 4 years already. We are very familiar with his campaign language and what he would do after he was elected. So look back into the 4 years he was in power. So I personally don't worry that much, because before the election, everyone knows that the candidates, they would try to win the election, but what they would do after might be very different from what they said before the election. So since we have already had Donald Trump for 4 years, so we could know if he was elected in November, then let's just go back to see what he did in the 4 years in his last term. Then I think we will get a better sense.
Okay, I think I gave you enough passion to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, thank you very much for the invitation. Actually, really love to be here with you. Very short introduction of myself. My name is Antonio Fiori. I am a professor at the University of Bologna. Actually, there are many people who consider the University of Bologna to be the oldest university in the world, having been established in 1088. So, but nobody knows if this is actually true or not. But eventually, those who work there really like to think that this is a real something that is really that actually really happened at that time. In any case, actually, I devoted my whole life to the study of the Korean Peninsula. The first time I came to Korea was 1997, and since actually I've never left Korea, meaning I have never given up studying the Korean Peninsula, and I've always been pretty much intrigued by inter-Korean relations. And on top of that, actually, I started to be pretty much interested in North Korean affairs from both domestic and foreign policy point of view. That is actually what I do. I basically tend to study the peninsula, so I'm very, very interested in inter-Korean relations. I have published widely on inter-Korean relations, basically from two different angles, if I can say, theoretically speaking, actually, from the historical point of view and from the political point of view. And of course, actually, I tend to intertwine. I tend to look at both dimensions because these are eventually for me pretty much important. Now, when it comes to North Korea, which is actually what we're going to talk about today, I've always found the Western approach and significantly the Italian approach pretty much unacceptable. I am the only one studying North Korea in Italy, or probably the only one doing that from a scientific point of view. And this is actually what I would like to specify. From the scientific point of view, actually, North Korea is something that it is really, really difficult to study for several reasons, actually, because of the regime, because of the history of the regime, because of how actually the regime behaved, because Kim Il-sung is not Kim Jong-un. I mean, characters are pretty much different, and eventually we need to pay attention to the different characters. We need to pay attention to the different strategies that every leader gives implementation to. Now, when it comes to the West, and as I was saying, significantly to Italy, what it is absolutely unacceptable is the fact that everybody looks at North Korea from a journalistic point of view, with a journalistic attitude, and this is eventually what I do not like. They want actually people to understand the country as if it really was the hermit kingdom everybody talks about, and if the regime was completely unpredictable and absolutely aggressive and violent and brutal, and I'm not saying this is not correct, but eventually this should be seen from a scientific point of view. In order to reinforce my position, if I can, I would like to give you an example of what I'm saying. In 2017, actually, when Chan Son-taek was executed, everybody, actually, many specialists, including me, were trying to look at that specific event from a scientific point of view. So why actually Chan Son-taek was killed, who was Chan Son-taek, what Chan Son-taek actually represented for the regime, what kind of alliances eventually could there be between Chan Son-taek and the Chinese leadership in the PRC. All these questions which were absolutely not easy to give an answer to. And instead of looking at that from this kind of perspective, what many journalists did, what the majority of journalists actually did in the West, was depicting Chan Son-taek as being killed by several dogs, as eventually as many in China actually wanted us to believe, which was actually not true. It was something, totally fabricated, invented by, a Chinese website. But actually, this is what we like to believe about the North Korean regime from a Western point of view. And this is absolutely not scientific. So again, I actually tend to do, a scientific kind of examination of North Korea. On top of that, actually, what I always tend to do is trying to understand what is the position of the different South Korean administrations when it comes to North Korea. And I've published a book on that, actually, an edited book, but eventually that was a very important one, because actually from the theoretical point of view, the question was how do progressive administrations in South Korea behave towards North Korea, and how conservatives actually do. And we basically tended to understand the two different positions. And actually, this was a very, very important kind of examination, a very important kind of analysis, because actually what we did discover was that basically when it comes to domestic kind of attitude, actually, progressive and conservatives in South Korea sometimes tend to have the same position, okay, when it comes to economics, for example, or when it comes to different policies that eventually are introduced, are adopted to help or support youngsters. When it comes to North Korea and to the approach that eventually South Korea has to North Korea, I mean, these can be very, very different. Moon Jae-in is not Lee Myung-bak. Lee Myung-bak is actually not Kim Dae-jung. And of course, Yoon Suk-yeol is completely different. But there are some contacts between progressives and some contacts between actually conservatives. And what we aimed at doing was trying to find these recurrent points. And, eventually this is something I'm pretty interested in. Nowadays, actually, what I'm doing, and, I'm having a lot of fun in doing that, is actually studying the so-called North Korea's third world diplomacy. That is actually something that North Korea started at doing in the late 50s, and it was kind of really successful in the 70s. What I'm talking about is actually the fact that North Korea became a very, very important protagonist, very important actor by actually linking to other countries in the so-called third world. And I am very, very interested in actually the policy that North Korea started by being involved in that famous group of nations that actually was labeled as the non-aligned movement. And so actually what I'm doing is eventually trying to understand, what were the contact points between North Korea and non-aligned movements. And the more I study this kind of topic, the more I convince myself that, there were only few contact points, but actually for the regime itself, aligning with the non-aligned movement actually was pretty much important, in order to gain legitimacy. And actually, they wanted, the leadership actually wanted to gain legitimacy in order to overcome South Korea. And, this is kind of really important because actually it's like, having a race. Okay, it's like a competition between North Korea and South Korea. But at that time, actually, North Korea, the only objective Pyongyang had was kind of depicting itself as being more mature than South Korea. It was not the case, but actually, this was the image Kim Il Sung wanted to give to the external world. And on top of that, actually, by aligning with these kind of third world nations, actually, North Koreans wanted to kind of making the image of Kim Il Sung being accepted, by as many countries as they could. Okay, and this is actually what I'm very interested in. A couple of more things, actually, if you allow me, I would like to add. The first is, going back to the first part of what I was saying. Actually, what is really puzzling is that kind of people in Italy are not really interested in North Korea. Actually, basically what Italians say about Kim Jong-un is that, he's mad. That's all. Point. Full stop. Period. Actually, nothing else. He is mad. He must be stopped. This is a regime that eventually takes into consideration the possibility of using nuclear weapons, and this is unacceptable. And these people are unpredictable, and these kind of things, which I really find kind of nonsensical. These kind of things actually should be understood, and eventually they ask for more. They want to understand more about North Korea. They want to understand more about these dictatorial kind of regime. For them, actually, the fact that Kim Jong-un is a brutal dictator is not eventually enough. They want to understand why, how we did get to this kind of position, and they want to understand what's the divide between South Korea and North Korea, why actually unification is kind of really impossible at this time. I mean, they need to understand. So students are really, really interested in it. The general public is not kind of really interested in understanding more about North Korea. So if I want, actually, I can stop here and eventually waiting for questions.
Okay, thank you for your interesting lecture on the point Italian perspective on North Korea, and then Western media's sensational report method or tendency, and why it's so hard for researchers and European researchers to study North Korea. Okay, my question is actually to elaborate your point, and then most of all, you mentioned again and again to approach North Korea's politics and then economy and then society, and at the same time human rights issues are not very well directed, and then especially the media, so-called Western media, you said they have some wrong method or wrong the directions to approach North Korean affairs. Why so? And then can you elaborate how wrong the North Korean media report from the Western perspective in the 2024?
Yeah, that's sure. Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question, actually. Now, don't get me wrong. again. This is kind of really important. The first message I would like to convey is not to get me wrong, because actually I'm not, of course, defending the regime. I'm not absolutely saying that the regime, needs to be defended. Of course, we're talking about a dictatorship. Of course, we're talking about a brutal regime. Of course, we are talking about a dictator, which is eventually leading the country. Okay, it's not about that. What I'm telling you is basically the fact that Western media tend to sensationalize everything about North Korea, just because actually you can't go. You're a journalist. Eventually, you can't have any access to North Korea, right? So you can't go there. You can't actually make interviews. You can't ask for sources. You don't have any access to the country. So actually, what I'm telling you is basically the fact that when Western media have to do with North Korea, the tendency is always to sensationalize without actually trying to understand what's there behind actually every behavior of the regime, every behavior of Kim Jong-un and the leadership. It's like we don't understand why, but it's okay. I mean, it's like it has a despicable kind of attitude, but we do not want to understand why this is so. Okay. We actually are not interested in trying to understand that eventually, the fact that North Korea has this kind of attitude, it's because it has to have a defensive posture. Okay, this is actually in the mind of the regime. I'm weak. This is my position as an analyst. For example, the North Korean regime is weak, and of course, actually, it has to defend itself because of its intrinsic weakness. Okay, we don't actually take that into account. What Western media tend to do is that they are so arrogant that eventually they are telling us that they could eventually put a warhead on a rocket and actually hit the American territory. Okay, and so actually what we tend to say is that how can you eventually think that? I mean, you can't do that just because that is the United States of America, and if only you take that into consideration, I mean, of course you must be irrational. Okay, this is actually one of the terms that is most used in the West. The North Korean regime is irrational. So I don't think it's irrational. I wrote actually 2 books in order to make people understand how rational the regime is. It's you must be actually rational to eventually work for like 7 decades on the development of the nuclear program. You must be pretty rational to do that. Because, at this point, actually, they have so many warheads that eventually, I mean, threatening the North Korean territory has become pretty impossible or very hard, actually. So you must be rational to do that. Nowadays, actually, working with the Russian Federation and another dictator like Putin, actually, it's a very, very rational kind of choice.
Yeah, I mean, my next question is just like what you said. What's your take on this? North Korea and Russia rapprochement in a military cooperation and then comprehensive strategic relationship treaty. What's your take on it?
What I was saying is that actually there were no important relations between Moscow and Pyongyang. Now the war has changed everything. Paradoxically, let me tell you that the war in Ukraine has changed everything for both Koreas, not only for North Korea. Let me tell you something. For North Korea, actually, the war has been pretty important, not only because actually, the link actually the economic link between North Korea and Russia has been developing, okay? And it has become very, very important and profitable for North Korea, okay? Not only because of that, what I am looking at nowadays is especially the diplomatic shield that actually North Korea has kind of obtained. Okay, you know well that actually whenever there were resolutions and the introduction of sanctions, actually China and Russia, both of them, voted in a positive way, right? I'm not saying that actually those votes were efficient, because we all know that China voted at the UNSC, and then actually on the other hand they said it's okay, we can overcome these whenever we want. But nowadays actually what they are doing is kind of creating a shield around North Korea. That is, whenever the US is asking at the UNSC to introduce more sanctions against North Korea, nowadays China and Russia, are saying, no way, we are vetoing that possibility. And this makes sense for North Korea at the diplomatic level. It makes a lot of sense. And on top of that, this kind of behavior China and Russia are having is actually pretty much important. It must be taken into consideration because of the buying time kind of approach North Korea has always had. We don't really know actually what North Korea is doing nowadays, right? Improving its nuclear arsenal, improving its nuclear weapons, whatever. But we don't know. We do absolutely not know what North Korea is doing by now. From the other point of view, actually, I really need to admit that eventually Trump was successful in order to engage Kim Jong-un at a very precise moment. But actually, Trump was not successful in doing anything else. What actually I do tend to believe is that especially the Singapore meeting was a showcase, nothing else for both of them. But actually what was important for Kim Jong-un was kind of being legitimized by the same presence, the same invitation of Trump. And nowadays, actually, what Biden eventually attempted at doing, kind of, we can talk, all right? I mean, he completely changed his position from the beginning of his term. At the beginning of his term, actually, he didn't want to talk to North Koreans. Nowadays, he's trying to, he has tried actually to find the possibility to talk to North Korea, but Kim Jong-un nowadays has no interest at all.
Okay. Well, then it's another hypothetical question for you. You mentioned Donald Trump, and then nobody can escape from the Donald Trump question. Yeah, and then we of course Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party, the presidential candidate officially right now she's competing with Donald Trump in the very, very competitive way. But Donald Trump presidency, number 2. If we think that the Donald Trump is going to have another term, and then what's going to happen to U.S. and North Korea relationship? You mentioned about Singapore, and then you mentioned probably Hanoi, and then probably somewhere where the Rome or Bologna.
I don't know if I have a good recipe for that, but actually I've always been pretty sure of one thing. If you want to engage North Korea, the only possibility we have is dialogue. That's the only possibility, re-engagement. If we actually tend to, create some kind of peaceful, engagement, if we tend to give some kind of stability, if actually we do start from, making efforts toward the possibility of creating a peace regime, not a peace treaty, a peace regime, which is much more precise, and it takes a lot of efforts more than a simple peace treaty. A peace regime is everything, okay? we need to establish a dialogue with North Korea. And actually, that's why I really appreciated what Trump did with Kim Jong-un. I didn't have the same idea. I am sure that something went wrong. I am sure that actually Trump had to make a lot of efforts more, especially in Hanoi, when actually he was suggested, he was asked by Kim Jong-un to eventually lift, 11 sanctions that have more impact on the population. Okay, not on the regime. They were absolutely useless for the regime. And on top of that, actually, we should take into account again, what's the need of actually, adopting more and more sanctions against the regime. I mean, this is something we should really take care of. Because in the case of North Korea, actually, the regime is not having any kind of problems because of sanctions. But again, dialogue.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Very lively, discussion with you, and I had fun. And always remember, Toscana, Italy, and then we will continue to communicate with you on the North Korea and the unification issue.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I will actually invite you to come again to Italy to visit.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. Okay.
Oh, no worries. It's my pleasure. I thank you very much again.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Will. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this project. I will start with some historical background about the field of North Korean, or in general, Korean studies in Poland. The field of Korean studies in Poland has its origins in the 1950s, emerging as a distinct area of academic research within the broader political context of the Cold War. The People's Republic of Poland was the third country in the world, after the Soviet Union and Mongolia, to establish diplomatic relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And until 1989, Poland maintained diplomatic relations exclusively with North Korea. And Polish belonging to the socialist camp meant that for decades, Korean studies in Poland developed in collaboration with North Korea. For example, the North Korean lecturers taught Korean language at the University of Warsaw. But it is also noteworthy that the field of Korean studies as a standalone discipline emerged only in 1983. So it's quite new. Prior to this, Korean was taught as one of the languages for students of sinology and Japanese studies. And the older generation of Polish scholarship on North Korea, the majority of whose authors are now deceased, benefited from Poland's relatively close political relations with North Korea until 1989. Consequently, they undertook frequent visits to North Korea, and some of their publications were propagandistic, I would say, in nature, often linked to their activities in societies like Korea-Poland Friendship Association or the Friends of the Juche idea. In the new political environment after 1989, contacts between Poland and North Korea were severely restricted at many levels. This was primarily due to the establishment of diplomatic relations between Poland and the Republic of Korea. And this also had an impact on Korean studies in Poland, with North Korean lecturers being replaced by South Korean ones. And the Republic of Korea institutions providing significant support for the development of Korean studies in Poland. Nevertheless, the primary area of focus remains cultural and language-related studies. In the years following 1989, North Korea was not a prominent subject of research within Polish academic centers specializing in Korean studies. And the level of interest in North Korea, both before and since that period, has been predominantly observed among scholars engaged in other fields of research. And to the best of my knowledge, there is no researcher in Poland whose work is solely focused on North Korean studies. Additionally, North Korea is occasionally the subject of university courses. For example, in 2018, I initiated a subject on North Korea's foreign policy at the Institute of the Middle and Far East of Jagiellonian University in Krakow. But of course, there are also several people in universities and academic research institutions for whom North Korean issues are one of the many fields they deal with. Research on North Korea in Poland includes mainly North Korean ideology and political system, and of course the history of Poland's relations with North Korea. And occasionally there are analyses, papers on North Korean foreign and security policy or inter-Korean relations. And the topic of North Korea is also considered in the context of other issues, such as weapons of mass destruction, missile technology, and the geopolitical situation in East Asia. And recently, there has been a growing interest in Poland in the strengthening the relationship between North Korea and Russia. North Korea is a relatively common topic in the Polish public sphere, in Polish media, but its presence is rather limited to sensationalistic discourse, I would say. And much of the news about the country is unreliable, I think, and not in depth. And of course, North Korea is typically depicted in Polish media as a totalitarian state that violates human rights. That's the most common perspective. And on the other hand, it is interesting to note the activity of a very, very small group of young people in Poland demonstrating their interest in North Korea. And these individuals typically represent radical left-wing and communist beliefs. They are active within small associations and engage extensively on social media, some of them even collaborating with the DPRK embassy in Warsaw. However, these groups have extremely marginal influence in the public sphere. That's my perspective on the North Korean studies and how North Korea is perceived in Polish public and by Polish young scholars, students. But my perspective as an analyst, it's quite different, I would say, because I'm an analyst of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, which is a public analytical institution based in Warsaw, Poland. And my work mainly involves conducting open source research and preparing public and non-public materials on the current situation in Northeast Asia, particularly on the Korean Peninsula. And my responsibilities extend beyond monitoring North Korea. I also engage with South Korea and Japan and security issues in Northeast Asia. And given the nature of my work, I pay a lot of attention to matters affecting Poland's foreign policy, whether directly or indirectly. According to the DPRK, my research is focused on its foreign and security policy. And with a background in international relations and PhD in political science, I'm particularly interested in the international context of the DPRK's foreign policy. And in my analysis of the DPRK's partnership or even alliance with the Russian Federation, I'm trying to incorporate the broader security interdependence between Europe and East Asia. For this reason, my research includes also inter-Korean relations and the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, because the analysis of these issues has become increasingly important for Poland, given our significant reliance on the import of South Korean weapons in recent 2 years. Furthermore, I'm particularly interested in the dynamics between the DPRK and the US and China. And of course, as a European, I also monitor the development of European-North Korean relations. For instance, over the years, I have engaged in track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues with North Korea alongside other European experts, I have lots of seminars, for example, at the European External Action Service on what the European Union could do more on DPRK issues. And as part of my responsibilities, I maintain regular communication with Polish public institutions and foreign diplomats based in Warsaw, including North Korean diplomats. It's quite interesting experience to have quite, I would say, dialogue with North Koreans based in Poland. But of course, it's sometimes it's strange, sometimes it's very interesting. And because of my interest on the prospects of the European North Korean relations, I would like also to share my few insights on these issues, because it's very interesting that the 26 member states of the European Union maintain diplomatic relations with the DPRK. Estonia, France, and Portugal do not. Regular communication with North Korea, which is now conducted exclusively through North Korean diplomats in European countries. And in 2023, North Korea initiated a cautious process of opening up to foreign delegations. This prompted some European countries to initiate discussions with the DPRK regarding the possible return of diplomats to Pyongyang as soon as possible. And in February this year, Germany and Swedish diplomats conducted a brief visit to North Korea to evaluate the status of their respective embassies in Pyongyang. However, further planned visits scheduled for May this year, which were to include Polish and British diplomats, among others, were unexpectedly, in fact, cancelled by the North Korean authorities. Officially postponed, but in fact cancelled. And concurrently, the presence of North Korean diplomats in several European countries continues to reflect the prevailing state of imbalance in diplomatic relations. North Korean diplomats are here, for example, in Warsaw or in other European capitals, but there are no diplomatic presence of European countries in Pyongyang. It is possible that the DPRK is deliberately limiting its foreign contacts as a part of a, wider strategy of de-risking its diplomatic activity. Because despite years of efforts to foster closer ties with countries in Europe and beyond, in my opinion, North Korea has discovered that opening up carries more risks than benefits for the functioning of a totalitarian state. This also applies to inter-Korean relations. Furthermore, adopting a confrontational stance towards the South is an integral aspect of the strategy that the North Korea has pursued since the beginning of the pandemic. This strategy is designed to counter the influence of external factors, such as, for example, South Korean popular culture within the North Korean society. And the future of North Korean relations, European North Korean relations, depends on, I think, only on the willingness of the North Korean authorities to maintain and develop them. For me, it seems unlikely that the DPRK would view European countries as a desirable guest in the current circumstances, unfortunately. And the potential benefits that the North Korean regime could derive from the presence of European diplomats need to be assessed realistically. Because if European diplomats eventually return to Pyongyang, it would be reasonable to consider how to proceed. One option would be, of course, to continue offering cultural cooperation and humanitarian and developmental aid, as has been the case in the past. This could involve the implementation of various smaller or bigger initiatives. However, it is unclear whether North Korea would benefit from such an approach, and the decision-making process within the regime is driven by its own interests rather than the needs of the people. So in the coming months, we will see whether North Korea will take steps to open up to the presence of European diplomats. If it becomes evident that North Korea is not prepared to accept diplomats from European countries, we may be faced with the difficult but perhaps necessary decision of not renewing diplomatic accreditation to North Korean diplomats in Europe, which would mean the expulsion of them from European countries on the basis of diplomatic reciprocity. That's my insights. I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Pietrowicz. Great and a very succinct, lecture on, 3 points, and the Polish, perspective on North Korea, Polish, community, academic and policy community on Korea, and including your own, research agendas. At the same time, the prospects for the European, North Korean relations. Great, and I have tons of questions, but we will start with your argument on this inter-Korea relationship and Europe. Do you see any interaction and then connection between Poland, South Korea arms deal, military cooperation, and Russia, North Korea arms deal in a military cooperation in last few years?
Yes, there is a very important connection, I think, because, the whole agreements between South Korea and Poland in recent years is related, of course, to the Russian aggression of Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's quite natural that the foreign policy of Russia is very important for foreign policy of Poland. And we have the situation in which South Korea supports massively Ukraine, but without directly military support. Yes. So it's two different perspectives. And I think, that South Korea has certainly skillfully used the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to boost its arms exports. There are many signs that the consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine are far-reaching for NATO, including the countries on the alliance eastern flank, especially Poland. And this is prompting Poland to invest heavily in armament to deter possible Russian aggression against Europe in the coming years. So it is therefore likely that there will continue to be a strong interest in developing defense capabilities in Central and Eastern Europe, which could create opportunities to further contracts from South Korea. But I would say that the threats to European and Asian security from the North Korean-Russian alliance should prompt NATO to strengthen political and intelligence cooperation with Asian partners within the NATO AP4 or IP4 format. Russian-North Korean cooperation, for example, should be, in my opinion, a permanent topic in the political military dialogue between Poland and South Korea. So the connection is very obvious from our perspective, but I would say that it's if you are interested in deals on buying weapons, on establish the defense industry cooperation. It's not only about it's not a trade, for example, smartphones, or it's very close related to the security policy. And that's why I think it's very important for Poland and South Korea to establish high-level political dialogue on the challenges resulted from the strengthening the partnership or even alliance between North Korea and Russia.
Good point, Dan. Thank you. Well, and then, yeah, I think totally agree with you. I think it's Poland and then South Korea. South Korea and Poland, they need to establish, high level, dialogue on this, more like very complex interaction between European, Ukraine theater and then, North Korea, Northeast Asian or, Indo-Pacific, theater, from the security point of view. I totally agree. Okay, thank you so much. Very informative and at the same time very logical answers to my question. Okay, thank you so much.